On September 15, 1942, the aircraft carrier USS Wasp was struck by 3 Japanese torpedoes in the South Pacific. Within 36 minutes, Captain Forrest Sherman gave the order to abandon ship. 5 hours later, she was scuttled by her own escort destroyer. 193 men died. The ship slipped beneath the waves and disappeared into the abyss. For 77 years, no one knew exactly where she came to rest. The official story was straightforward. The Wasp was a compromised design, a carrier built too small and too light because of treaty limitations. She lacked torpedo protection. She had inadequate firefighting systems. When the torpedoes hit, she never stood a chance. Case closed. Except historians never stopped arguing about it. Some called her the worst aircraft carrier ever built. Others insisted she was simply unlucky, a victim of the most devastating submarine attack of the entire war. The Navy concluded she could have survived the torpedoes if not for the fires that followed. But the fires were inevitable given her design. The logic chased its own tail for decades. Then in January 2019, an advanced underwater drone descended nearly 14,000 feet to the floor of the Coral Sea. What it found sitting upright in the darkness, miles from where navigators believed she sank, would force a re-examination of everything we thought we understood about America's most controversial aircraft carrier. The footage revealed damage patterns that tell a more complicated story than any official report. The question is no longer whether the Wasp was flawed. The question is whether those flaws were truly unavoidable, or whether 193 men died because of decisions made in treaty negotiations a full decade before the first shot of the war was fired. The answer lies 14,000 feet down, and the implications reach far beyond one ship. The USS Wasp was never supposed to exist. She was a mathematical remainder, a ship conjured into being by treaty arithmetic rather than strategic necessity. After the Navy built the carriers Yorktown and Enterprise, the Washington Naval Treaty still permitted 15,000 tons of carrier construction. Not enough for a proper fleet carrier. Too much to leave unused. So the Navy did what bureaucracies do. They built something anyway. Commissioned in April 1940, the Wasp stretched 720 feet from bow to stern and could carry 76 aircraft. On paper, she looked like her larger sisters. In reality, she was something else entirely. The engineers had squeezed a full-sized air group onto a hull 25% smaller than the Yorktown class. The compromises required to achieve this would define her short life and violent death. But the men who served aboard her did not think of compromises. They thought of her as home. The crew had been together longer than most, a consequence of extended deployments that left little time for personnel transfers. They knew their ship. They knew each other. Veterans would later describe the Wasp as one of the finest commands in the Navy, a team that had trained together so long they operated as a single organism. Her early service took her to the Atlantic, where she supported the American occupation of Iceland and joined the British Home Fleet. In April 1942, the Wasp received orders that would cement her place in history. Twice she ferried British Spitfire fighters to the besieged island of Malta, launching aircraft that helped turn the tide in the Mediterranean. Winston Churchill himself sent a message after the second delivery, asking who said a Wasp couldn't sting twice. The crew painted the words on a ready room bulkhead. Then came the losses at Coral Sea and Midway. The Pacific Fleet was bleeding carriers. Lexington was gone. Yorktown was gone. The calculus shifted. A compromise carrier was better than no carrier at all. In June 1942, Captain Forrest Sherman took command, and the Wasp sailed for the South Pacific. Sherman was 46 years old, a Naval Academy graduate who had spent his career in aviation. Those who served under him used words like brilliant and exceptional. He would later become the youngest chief of naval operations in Navy history. But in the summer of 1942, he was simply the captain of a carrier headed into the most desperate naval campaign of the war. The Wasp supported the Marine landings on Guadalcanal in August, her aircraft pounding Japanese positions, while American boys stormed the beaches below. For weeks afterward, she patrolled the waters around the Solomon Islands, escorting convoys and providing air cover for the tenuous American foothold. The crew settled into the grinding rhythm of combat operations. Launch, recover, refuel, launch again. September 15th began like any other day. The Wasp was escorting transports carrying the 7th Marine Regiment to reinforce Guadalcanal. The morning passed without incident. By early afternoon, aircraft were being refueled on the flight deck and in the hangar below. The ship hummed with routine activity. 600 feet beneath the surface, the Japanese submarine I-19 had been tracking the American task force since mid-morning. Her commander, Takakazu Kanashi, watched through his periscope as the carriers maneuvered. At 2:44 in the afternoon, with the Wasp turning into the wind to recover aircraft, Kanashi fired 6 torpedoes in a spread pattern designed to maximize the chances of a hit. The lookouts spotted the wakes too late. The helmsman threw the wheel hard to starboard, but the bow had barely begun to swing when the first torpedo struck, then the second, then the third. All 3 hit the port side in the vicinity of the aviation fuel tanks and forward magazines. The explosions were catastrophic. Gasoline ignited instantly, sending flames roaring through the forward part of the ship. The blasts ruptured the water mains that fed the firefighting systems. They knocked out the power that ran the pumps. In a single moment, the Wasp lost both the means to fight the fires and the ability to contain them. What happened next would be debated for decades. Captain Sherman maneuvered the stricken carrier with extraordinary skill, positioning her so the wind blew the flames forward, away from the men still aboard. Damage control teams fought the inferno with nothing but handheld extinguishers and raw courage. For 36 minutes, they believed they might save her. They could not. The fire spread faster than any effort could contain them. Ammunition cooked off in the heat. Explosions ripped through compartments where men were still working. At 3:20 in the afternoon, Sherman consulted with Rear Admiral Lee Noyes, whose flag flew from the Wasp, and gave the order to abandon ship. The evacuation took 40 minutes. Wounded men went first, lowered into rafts and rubber boats. The able-bodied slid down ropes or leaped from the listing flight deck into water slicked with burning fuel. Sherman moved through the chaos, ensuring no one was left behind. Only when he was satisfied that every living man had departed did he swing over the lifeline on the fantail and drop into the sea. The Wasp burned for another 5 hours. 4 massive explosions shook her at nightfall, but she still would not sink. Finally, the destroyer Lansdowne was ordered to put her down. The first 2 American torpedoes failed to detonate. A terrible irony, given that American torpedo failures would plague the Navy throughout the war. 3 more torpedoes were fired with their magnetic exploders disabled. All 3 hit. Still, the Wasp lingered. She finally slipped beneath the waves at 9 o'clock that evening, sinking bow first into the darkness. Of the 2,247 men aboard when the attack began, 193 were dead and 366 wounded. The survivors, plucked from the water by 5 destroyers, watched their ship disappear. Many wept. The 3 torpedoes that missed the Wasp traveled on for another 5 miles before finding other targets. One struck the battleship North Carolina. Another hit the destroyer O'Brien. It was the most devastating single submarine attack of the entire Pacific War, and the arguments about why the Wasp died began before her fires were even cold. I think you mean the next act. Act 2, the treaty ship. Let me write that section. The official explanation for why the Wasp sank emerged almost immediately. She was too small, too lightly armored, too poorly protected against the exact weapons that killed her. The design compromises that saved weight had cost lives. The Navy said so. The historians agreed. The case seemed closed. But the question that lingered was whether those compromises were ever truly necessary. And the answer lies not in the Pacific, but in a conference room in Washington more than a decade before the first torpedo was fired. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 was supposed to prevent another world war. The great powers had watched the arms race that preceded 1914 and concluded that competitive shipbuilding had helped drag Europe into catastrophe. If they could limit the size of navies, perhaps they could limit the scale of future conflicts. The logic seemed sound. The execution was something else. The treaty imposed strict tonnage limits on aircraft carriers. The United States was permitted 135,000 tons total. After building Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown, and Enterprise, the Navy had exactly 15,000 tons remaining. Not enough for another fleet carrier of the Yorktown class, which displaced nearly 20,000 tons. But the admirals were not about to leave tonnage on the table. They would build something. The result was a ship designed backward. Instead of determining what capabilities a carrier needed and then building to meet them, the engineers started with a fixed displacement and crammed in whatever they could. The Wasp would carry a full air group. She would have the speed to operate with the fleet. Everything else was negotiable. The first casualty was armor. The Yorktown class carried substantial protection around vital spaces. The Wasp received a maximum of 4 inches in the most critical areas, with much of the ship protected by less than an inch of steel. The conning tower, where the captain would fight the ship, had just an inch and a half. A determined rifle bullet could have penetrated some sections. The second casualty was torpedo protection. Fleet carriers typically featured torpedo bulges along their hulls, hollow compartments designed to absorb the force of an underwater explosion before it reached vital machinery. The Wasp had none. Her boilers and aviation fuel tanks sat directly behind the outer hull with nothing between them and the sea but a thin skin of steel. The third casualty was damage control capability. The firefighting systems were adequate for peacetime operations but marginal for combat conditions. The ship's internal subdivision was less robust than her larger sisters. If something went seriously wrong, the tools to fix it might not exist. Damaged naval architects recognized these weaknesses before the keel was ever laid. Internal memoranda from the period describe a ship that would be uniquely vulnerable to the exact threats a carrier was likely to face in combat. One assessment concluded that the absence of side protection for the boilers and aviation fuel stores would doom her to a blazing demise if she ever took a torpedo hit in those areas. They built her anyway. Vulnerable. This is the fact that transforms the Wasp story from a tragedy of war into something more troubling. The men who designed her knew she was fatally compromised. The men who approved her construction knew it too. They accepted the risk because the alternative was building nothing, and nothing was strategically unacceptable. A flawed carrier was better than no carrier, probably. Compromised. The Navy tried to manage the risk by keeping the Wasp away from the most dangerous waters. Her initial assignment to the Atlantic was not coincidental. German naval aviation was limited. The U-boat threat was serious, but submarines in the Atlantic operated alone rather than in coordinated wolf packs with air support. If the Wasp had to fight, the Atlantic gave her better odds than the Pacific, where Japanese naval forces were considered far more capable of delivering decisive damage. Atlantic. The calculus held until it could not. After Coral Sea and Midway, the Pacific Fleet had exactly 3 operational carriers: Enterprise, Saratoga, and Hornet. The Japanese had more. The desperate arithmetic of attrition overrode every other consideration. The Wasp was transferred to the Pacific in June 1942. Her known vulnerabilities suddenly less important than her available flight deck. Transferred. The men aboard were not told they were sailing on a ship designed to fail. They knew she was smaller than the other carriers. They knew she was different, but the specifics of her compromises were not common knowledge among the crew. They trusted that the Navy would not send them into battle on a vessel that could not protect them. That trust would prove misplaced. Trust. But whether it was misplaced because of unavoidable treaty constraints or because of choices made by men who should have known better remains the central controversy of the Wasp story. The critics call her the worst aircraft carrier of the war, a ship whose loss was inevitable from the moment she was designed. The defenders argue she was simply unlucky, a victim of superb Japanese torpedoes and the fog of war. Controversy. The Navy's own post-war assessment tried to split the difference. It concluded that the Wasp could have survived the 3 torpedo hits if not for the fires that followed. The torpedo damage alone would not have sunk her. But the fires, fed by aviation gasoline and uncontrollable without functioning water mains, had sealed her fate. Post-war, this conclusion satisfied no one. The fires were inevitable precisely because the ship lacked the protection that would have contained them. Saying she could have survived the torpedoes without the fires was like saying a man could have survived the bullet, if not for the bleeding. Technically true, practically meaningless. Meaningless for 77 years, the argument circled without resolution. The Wasp lay somewhere in the Coral Sea, depth unknown, condition unknown, holding physical evidence that might answer questions the documents could not. No one had the technology to reach her. No one knew exactly where to look. The debate remained theoretical, fought with paper and speculation rather than physical proof. Evidence. Then Paul Allen's research vessel arrived with equipment that could reach places humans never could. The theoretical became suddenly, startlingly concrete. Concrete. If you are still here, you now understand this was not just a wartime tragedy. Men were sent into combat on a ship that her own designers knew would burn if torpedoes found her. Comment the number 2 below if you are following this story. If you have not subscribed, please do so and turn on the bell notification so you do not miss what comes next. Your support helps us tell the stories that official histories often leave incomplete. Now, let us see what 77 years of darkness finally revealed. Paul Allen made his fortune building Microsoft alongside Bill Gates. He spent a considerable portion of it chasing ghosts beneath the sea. The Microsoft co-founder had a lifelong fascination with World War II and a particular obsession with the ships that fought it. Beginning in 2015, he funded expeditions to locate historically significant wrecks across the Pacific. He equipped his research vessel, Petrel, with technology that could reach depths no human diver would ever survive, including sonar systems that could map the ocean floor from miles above, autonomous underwater vehicles that could search methodically for days, and remotely operated vehicles capable of descending into the crushing blackness of the abyss and sending back images in crystalline detail. The Petrel's record of discoveries read like a catalog of American naval history. It found the aircraft carrier Lexington, lost at Coral Sea. It found the cruiser Indianapolis, which sank after delivering components for the atomic bomb. It found the carrier Hornet, which launched the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. It found the cruiser Helena and the destroyer Ward, which fired the first American shots of the Pacific War. Each discovery brought closure to families who had waited decades to know where their loved ones rested. Each provided historians with physical evidence that documents alone could never supply. Allen died in October 2018, but he had arranged for the expeditions to continue. His estate funded ongoing operations, and the Petrel's crew maintained the mission he had championed. In January 2019, they turned their attention to the Wasp. Finding her would not be simple. The navigational techniques of 1942 relied heavily on celestial observation, using the stars and instruments like sextants to determine position. Under combat conditions, with ships maneuvering violently and crews focused on survival rather than record-keeping, the accuracy of position reports degraded significantly. Different vessels in the task force had recorded different coordinates for where the Wasp went down. The estimates diverged by miles. The Petrel's crew began with the best available data and worked outward. They deployed autonomous underwater vehicles to scan the seafloor with side-scan sonar, searching for the distinctive signature of a large wreck against the flat expanse of the abyssal plain. The process was methodical and slow. Each autonomous underwater vehicle dive covered a limited area. The ocean floor at 14,000 feet offers few landmarks. Days passed. Weather intervened. A crew member fell ill, forcing an unplanned port call. The search area expanded as initial scans came back empty. The team began to suspect that the historical position data was even less accurate than they had assumed. They recalculated. Factoring in the geometry of the torpedo attack, the time elapsed between the hits and the sinking, and the currents that might have carried a drifting hulk. The new search area lay miles from where they had started. On January 14, 2019, 12 days after the mission began, the sonar returned to contact. The signature was unmistakable. A large object, roughly the dimensions of an aircraft carrier, sat upright on the bottom. The crew sent down the remotely operated vehicle. What the cameras revealed as they descended through 14,000 feet of darkness would reshape the historical understanding of September 15, 1942. The Wasp sat upright on the seafloor, her hull largely intact despite the violence of her end. The cold and pressure of the deep ocean had preserved her in ways that shallower wrecks never experience. Bacterial decay, which consumes wooden structures and organic material in warmer waters, proceeds almost imperceptibly in the near-freezing temperatures of the abyss. Steel corrodes slowly without oxygen. The ship that emerged from the darkness looked less like a ruin than a monument, arrested in time at the moment of her death. The remotely operated vehicle moved methodically across the wreck, its lights illuminating sections of hull that no human eye had seen since 1942. The flight deck, where aircraft had launched and recovered in the final hours. The island superstructure, where Captain Sherman had fought to save his command. The gun tubs that had bristled with anti-aircraft weapons. The 5-inch mounts that had never fired at the enemy that killed her. The torpedo damage was immediately visible. The port side of the hull showed massive breaches where the Japanese weapons had struck. The holes gaped in the remotely operated vehicle's lights, edges torn inward by the force of detonation. The location of the impacts confirmed what survivors had reported. All 3 torpedoes had hit in the worst possible place, the forward section where aviation fuel was stored and where the magazines held bombs and ammunition. But the cameras captured details that went beyond simple confirmation. The pattern of blast damage told a story of cascading catastrophe. The initial explosions had not merely started fires. They had ruptured the structural integrity of internal bulkheads designed to contain flooding and confine damage. The water mains that should have fed the firefighting systems showed evidence of being shattered by the same blasts that ignited the fuel. The ship had been crippled in multiple ways simultaneously, each wound making the others more lethal. The fire damage extended far beyond the torpedo impact points. Scorching and deformation marked the hull plating for hundreds of feet, evidence of the inferno that had raged for 5 hours before the scuttling. The hangar deck area showed the most severe burning, consistent with reports that aviation gasoline had spread through the ship's interior before igniting. Compartments that might have provided refuge had become crematoriums. Aircraft debris littered the sea floor around the wreck. 45 planes had gone down with the ship, and fragments of their remains lay scattered in the sediment. Wings, engine cowlings, the distinctive shapes of Wildcat fighters and Dauntless dive bombers, broken but recognizable. Each piece marked where something had fallen as the Wasp made her final plunge. The bridge structure remained partially intact, the windows blown out but the framework still standing. This was where Sherman had made his decisions in the chaos of the attack, where he had maneuvered the ship to protect his crew from the flames, where he had given the order to abandon and then waited until every other man was off before leaving himself. The cameras lingered on it, recording details that might help historians reconstruct the sequence of events in those critical minutes. The remotely operated vehicle documented the bow, angled into the sea floor where the Wasp had struck bottom after her final descent. The forward section showed the heaviest damage, consistent with a bow first sinking. The stern remained more intact, the propellers and rudder visible in the murk. Between them, the debris field spread across the ocean floor, a scatter pattern that specialists would analyze for years. The Petrel crew spent days examining the wreck, capturing thousands of images and hours of video. They mapped the site in 3 dimensions, creating a digital record that would allow researchers to study the Wasp without ever descending to her depth. They documented everything they could reach, knowing that each frame might contain evidence invisible to the naked eye, but significant to experts who knew what to look for. When they finally surfaced and announced their discovery, the naval history community responded with intense interest. Here at last was physical evidence that could settle debates that had raged for nearly 8 decades. The footage would be analyzed, interpreted, and argued over, and what it showed was both simpler and more damning than anyone had expected. The submarine that killed the Wasp was among the most capable in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The I-19 carried the Type 95 torpedo, a weapon that outclassed anything in the American arsenal. Pure oxygen propulsion, almost no visible wake, over 1,000 pounds of explosive in each warhead. When it hit, ships died. Commander Takakazu Kanashi had been tracking the American task force since morning. 2 carriers, a battleship, destroyers in screening formation. He waited for his moment. At 2:44 in the afternoon, with the Wasp turning into the wind to recover aircraft, he fired all 6 forward tubes in a spread pattern designed to maximize hits against a maneuvering target. Lookouts spotted the incoming torpedoes with perhaps 15 seconds of warning. The helmsman threw the wheel hard over. It was not nearly enough time. 3 torpedoes struck the port side in rapid succession. One actually breached the surface before impact, hitting near the aviation fuel bunkers. The other 2 punched through thin plating and detonated against machinery with no protection whatsoever. Fuel tanks ruptured. Gasoline sprayed across hot metal and ignited. The same explosions that started the fires destroyed the means to fight them. Water mains shattered. Pumps lost power. Within minutes, the Wasp was burning from bow to midships. The 3 torpedoes that missed did not stop traveling. 5 miles beyond the burning carrier, they found new targets. One struck the battleship North Carolina, blowing a hole 32 feet wide and killing 5 men. Another hit the destroyer O'Brien in the bow. She would sink a month later when her compromised hull failed at sea. 1 salvo, 6 torpedoes. An aircraft carrier sunk, a destroyer sunk, a battleship crippled. The most destructive single submarine attack in naval history. The I-19 escaped despite 80 depth charges. She would not survive the war, sunk with all hands in November 1943. But the damage from that September afternoon had long since been absorbed into the terrible arithmetic of the Pacific. A Yorktown-class carrier might have survived those 3 hits: torpedo bulges to absorb blast energy, robust compartmentalization to contain flooding, capable damage control systems to fight the fires. The Yorktown herself had survived bombs and a torpedo at Midway, remaining afloat until a second attack finished her the next day. But the Wasp was not a Yorktown. She was a treaty ship, built to fill a tonnage allotment rather than to survive combat. Every weakness her designers had identified and accepted came due on September 15, 1942. The men aboard paid the price for decisions made by men who would never go to sea. The ROV footage settled some questions and left others permanently unresolved. The torpedo damage was exactly where the designers had known the ship was most vulnerable. The fire spread exactly as internal assessments had predicted it would. The lack of protection did exactly what the architects had warned it would do. Nothing that happened on September 15, 1942, surprised anyone who had read the memoranda written before the Wasp was ever launched. This is the fact that elevates the loss from tragedy to something harder to name. The men who designed the Wasp knew she would burn if torpedoes found her fuel tanks. The men who approved her construction knew it too. The men who transferred her to the Pacific knew she lacked the protection that might save her in waters where Japanese submarines operated with lethal efficiency. At every step, someone understood the risk. At every step, someone decided to accept it. The 193 men who died were not merely killed by Japanese torpedoes. They were killed by calculations made in conference rooms years before the war began. Whether those calculations were justified remains the question the footage cannot answer. The treaty imposed constraints that left no good options. Building nothing meant fewer flight decks when flight decks were desperately needed. Building a compromised carrier meant accepting that men might die because of the compromise. Both choices carried costs. The men who made the decision chose one set of costs over another. The men who sailed on the Wasp paid the price of that choice. The survivors carried the memory forward. Captain Forrest Sherman rose to become the youngest chief of naval operations in Navy history, commanding the entire United States Navy at age 49. David McCampbell, who had served as launching officer on the Wasp, became the leading Navy ace of the war, shooting down 34 enemy aircraft. The lessons learned from the Wasp's loss influenced carrier design for decades. The Essex class that followed had the torpedo protection and damage control systems that might have saved her. The Wasp herself lies 14,000 feet down in the Coral Sea. A war grave protected by depth and darkness and cold. The 193 men who died remain with their ship, preserved in the near-freezing water that stops decay and holds time still. The ROV footage showed their final resting place but did not disturb it. Some things are better documented than touched. The debate continues. Was she the worst aircraft carrier of the war, doomed from the drawing board? Or was she simply unlucky, a capable ship caught by superb weapons in the wrong place at the wrong moment? The evidence supports both conclusions. The design flaws were real, but so was the heroism. The treaty constraints were real, but so were the choices made within them. Perhaps certainty is too much to ask. The Pacific keeps its secrets. The dead keep their silence. The ship sits upright in the darkness. Nearly 2.5 miles down, holding the answer to a question no treaty ever anticipated. What happens when peacetime politics meet wartime reality? 193 men learned the answer. The rest of us can only visit and remember and wonder whether it ever had to be this way.